Okay. Okay. Here we are. This is Saturday. This is December 3rd. We're now 3 weeks or so, a little more past the election. And it's really an exciting world that we're in. As has been said, paraphrasing Pushkin, the script has not been written yet for the new administration. And so that's where we're going to take off from. This was, I believe, presented as a discussion of Hamilton, and certainly it will be implicitly. I'm not going to dwell a lot today on Hamilton. We'll talk about the 4 laws that Lyndon LaRouche has derived from Hamilton, which we took up, and Alexander Hamilton was with us up to Capitol Hill this last week. Delegations came in from the East Coast, from Virginia, Maryland, New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, and so forth. And we'll be doing that again next week because we have this window of opportunity with the so-called lame duck congressional session to actually put Glass-Steagall through, which needs to go into place now. And that is the first step in terms of the 4 steps, the 4 laws that Mr. LaRouche has defined is critical to an economic recovery of the United States and the United States playing the role it needs to play in the world. I want to stress again, and I'm not alone in this. This is our assessment as the Scheller Institute. This is Lyndon Helga LaRouche's assessment that the election was not a vote for Trump. This was a vote against globalization. And that will lead directly into the discussions today. People went, as Paul Gallagher said, and I encourage people to go back on the LaRouche PAC website and listen to the fireside chat from Thursday. That would have been the first. Paul's presentation there was excellent in discussing the national bank and really just to quote him, he said people went to the polls with earplugs in the ears. You know, they were not listening to the crazy stuff that Trump was saying, but they heard him, you know, and said, well, this guy is a builder. This guy is, you know, he's against free trade. He's going to renegotiate NAFTA and kill the TPP. Yeah. And he doesn't want to go to war. So against Russia or China or anyone else. In fact, in Ohio, on the first stop of Trump's tour around the country, Donald Trump, president-elect, in Ohio, let me just quote him because this has not been widely covered so far as I know. But in his remarks in Cincinnati, he said, I'm just quoting from him, and this is in one of those fake news outlets called TASS. They covered it. Donald Trump said, the president-elect also promised, you know, he's speaking in the third person, but this is him, he's speaking. The president-elect also promised to cooperate with any country interested in destroying the Islamic State. We will partner with every nation that is willing to join us in the effort to defeat ISIS and radical Islamic terrorism. And he continued, we will destroy ISIS. At the same time, we will pursue a new foreign policy that finally learns from the mistakes of the past. We will stop looking to topple regimes and overthrow governments, folks. So that's Trump in Cincinnati 2 days ago. So again, this is an indication. This is what people wanted. And he concluded apparently his remarks in Cincinnati saying, you're the movement. I'm merely the messenger. Almost a Shelley-esque kind of statement.
Antiwar.com has endorsed Trump early on because he's always been against frivolous uses of the U.S. military. I mean, it goes way back.
Yeah, let me stick to the main thread. But yes, there's been lots of people that have noted that he's been and made anti-war statements throughout. Now, there's going to be more surprises, more developments very rapidly now. Tomorrow, Sunday, December 4th, we have elections in Austria. We have the referendum, constitutional referendum in Italy, which could bring down the Renzi government, technocratic government, and it could send a shockwave through the banks that are already being leveraged against, speculated against. The Financial Times, other outlets from London and Wall Street have been warning that the defeat of this so-called reform of the referendum of the Constitution in Italy, which would allow, among other things, the prime minister to go to war without parliamentary approval. He could just do it. That the defeat of this so-called reform could be it for 6, 7, 8 Italian banks. And if that happens, that's not going to be limited in terms of the shock effect to Italy. That will spread to Deutsche Bank, that will spread to Barclays and Bank of Scotland, and to the counterparties here in the United States. So that in itself could be a very dramatic set of developments. You also have coming up, you have President Putin of Russia will be going to Japan as the personal guest of Abe, the Prime Minister Abe. That'll be on the 15th. And in the course of the last few days, the foreign minister of Japan has been in Moscow, meeting with Lavrov and Putin and others, finalizing the agreements that are going to be announced out of the visit on the 15th. I assume 15th, 16th, something like that. But these are outgrowths of the policy proposals that 5-6 point program that Abe had made back early in the summer on his visit to Sochi in Russia to meet with Putin. So all of this is occurring. As well, you have dramatic changes here in the United States. I'll come back to Russia and China in just a minute. But this is really an opportunity to reshape the Democratic Party in a positive way, a profound way. There really are two ways in which the Democratic Party could go. The Democratic Party, I'm speaking on a national level, in the Congress and so forth, could just become an obstructionist party, you know, kind of parroting what the Republican Party was over the last 4 to 8 years. That's one way it could go. And you could imagine Nancy Pelosi and others, you know, choosing to do that. On the other hand, the Democratic Party could decide to take Trump, if you will, at his word and say, all right, we're willing to work with you on the following. And this is exactly what Senator Schumer of New York, leader of the Senate Democrats, stated just 2 days ago. He said, I stand ready to work with the incoming administration to press a major infrastructure bill of $1 trillion in real federal funding. This is possible in the first 100 days of the new administration. And we have the statements of Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, Senator Warren, Senator Bernie Sanders, independent, Maxine Waters on the Finance Committee in the House. Others essentially have said the same thing over the course of the last few weeks since the election. So the potential is there for an initiative, a bold set of initiatives that would really bring forth a FDR-style recovery program based essentially on LaRouche's 4 laws. And that's why our delegations are up on Capitol Hill. So again, we really have to look at this from the standpoint of the potential of this whole process in both parties or across parties or above the parties. Because again, this was a vote against globalization. And there's the alternative to that, the new Silk Road. Just to refer to briefly, in the last few days, on the 30th of November, in the case of China, December 1st, in the case of Russia with President Putin, they've reached out. In Russia, President Vladimir Putin just gave the equivalent of their State of the Union address to the parliament there. And in his address, which was largely devoted to domestic issues and specifically to the issue of creativity and developing the creative capacities of children and developing, the next generation, the next coming generations of Russian citizens, he also took time to say the following as regarding the incoming Trump administration. Quote, Russia is also ready to work with the new U.S. administration. Cooperation between Russia and the United States in addressing global and regional issues will benefit the whole world. We have a shared responsibility to ensure international security and stability. We do not want confrontation with anyone. We have no need for it. We do not seek and never have sought enemies. We need friends. But we will not allow our interests to be infringed upon or ignored. China, just the day prior, released, the People's Republic of China released a special white paper, which is available. It's available in English. It's available through the official websites. It's titled The Right to Development, China's Philosophy, Practice, and Contribution. And it spells out, not only for China, but for the world, the right to economic development, really echoing statements that go back to Pope Paul in terms of the Vatican, but really echoing going back to at least John Quincy Adams. So I'm not going to go into that in detail, other than to say that among the things that the president or that the paper presents is really a review of the stunning accomplishments of China. In 1945, longevity in China was 35 years. In 2015, it was 76.34 years, average lifespan, a doubling of lifespans. The GDP growth is even more phenomenal, and they review the question of healthcare and other areas. I'll repeat that figure. I was asked to repeat that figure. In 1949, longevity in China was just 35 years. Now, the complete figures are from 2015. The lifespan on average is 76.34 years. Wow. So the report covers that in pointing to the success of the China model. And of course, China is exporting their model with the one belt, one road. And perhaps we'll get back to that a bit. So this is the white paper, Putin's remarks. All of this, of course, is in the context of the incoming administration, the new Trump administration, but also the changes going on everywhere. I mean, the revolt against globalization, perhaps I should just underscore this, is not simply in the United States. This is a phenomena throughout the transatlantic region, at least on both sides of the Atlantic, from the Brexit vote to the Hollande, the Prime Minister of France, just announced that he will not run again. He's down to 4% support. Hollande, who has been one of those that's been promoting the confrontation with Russia and China, and so he's going down in smoke and flames. You have this expected referendum defeat in Italy. We'll see how that plays out. But again and again and again, we see this revolt going on against globalization. So that's where I want to pick up here today in terms of the economics of Alexander Hamilton and LaRouche. And I want to just point out, first of all, that we now have available, and it's available on Amazon.com, the 4 economic reports of Alexander Hamilton, together with LaRouche's 4 laws, in a paperback book. It's titled The Vision of Alexander Hamilton. It's the 4 economic reports to Congress and to the president at the time in full. And it's $9.99 and plus shipping, and less if you do it Kindle or whatever. But if you want the actual physical book, it's $9.99 plus shipping. So it's there, and it's a great Christmas gift, among other things. I'm seconded on that. It's a great Christmas gift. So so really, we have readings of this going on around the country. We're going to be continuing that into the new year. The readings of Hamilton's reports, because every American now needs to become literate again in economics. So let's just ask the question rhetorically. Well, what is global? What has been globalization? This is a term, and people have a sense that there's a kind of visceral opposition to this. But in physical economic terms, which Hamilton would certainly understand, and certainly is the basis of LaRouche's physical economy, if you look at globalization, most fundamentally, globalization has been the reduction of the portion of production, of output, of wealth, going to wages, going to the working population. That has been shrinking. The share of economic activity, to phrase it differently, going to the workforce has been shrinking. While at the same time, there's been a shift in that economic activity in terms of the wealth produced through economic activity, going to financial activities, financial services, financial speculation, what's become known as the service economy. And of course, this has gone on over decades. This shift has been going on since at least 1971, since the dollar was taken off the gold standard. And really, you could date it from the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Now, the forms. If you remember, if you were around, otherwise you may have read about it, in 1976, when Jimmy Carter came in as President of the United States, we began rounds of deregulation. The deregulation of the trucking industry. Trucking in this country was largely organized through the Interstate Commerce Commission. Rates were set. Companies bid to be able to drive certain routes for deliveries and of goods between companies and so forth. As part of that arrangement, wage levels were set more or less, guaranteeing a decent wage. Hours, the number of hours a driver could be on the road were set, and so on and so forth, at levels which guaranteed a decent standard of living, guaranteed safety on the road, and the rest. And along with airlines, we have the deregulation of trucking, the deregulation of airlines. We've had the deregulation of everything, including the electricity, deregulation of electricity, but the deregulation of education. All these private schools, charter schools, these phony fly-by-night universities and so forth, gouging veterans and so forth. I mean, this is, so this has been part of this stripping of the standards of living of the population, and the outsourcing, of course, of manufacturing is part of this process as well. To China, to Vietnam, to Nicaragua, to you name it, Mexico, and so on and so forth. That's been the process of globalization. Now, if we'll just go to the first, I've just got a series of some graphics and pictures here. I mean, this is what we now think of, even if they're not necessarily conscious of it. This is what we think of it in terms of when we think about economic activity, because we ask ourselves, is the stock market going up or going down? That's how most people think about these things. Perhaps you remember 401ks. I don't even know if anybody holds them anymore, but supposedly that we were all going to get rich on our 401ks. Who needed a pension? We could just have a 401k and we'd get rich with the market. And the market is no longer those guys on the trading floor. I mean, that occurs. But most of the trading is done electronically. It's done by guys sitting in front of masses of computer screens with charts, utilizing algorithms, increasingly more complex algorithms to make decisions to flash trade and so on and so forth. Some of this has been made into movies. People know about this. The result of this, the result of globalization, the result of this destruction of the standards of living of the workforce in the United States and similarly in Europe and elsewhere, has been the collapse of productivity. If you see here on the far right, you see the period 2007-2015, essentially the period from really the start of the financial crash, which was in mid 2007. Actually, LaRouche called it then, through 2015, and you see that the productivity increases is running around 1% per annum. And believe me, these figures are fudged. I mean, these are the figures of the Obama administration, and before it was the figures of the Bush administration. So, you can't really base yourself and say that these are realistic. But nonetheless, you see the difference. Compare that to the 47-73 period. That's after World War II, up into the early 70s. An average increase of productivity of almost 3%. So you're talking about that rise in productivity, even officially, being sliced in half, more than half, and reversing a trend of recovery in the 1990-2007 period. Now, again, I would warn you on that, because that's dot-coms, that's Silicon Valley, that's again adjusting these things with algorithms to say, well, gee, we know somehow that utilizing more laptops out there and more software is resulting in productivity increases somewhere for somebody. And of course, most of that was in the service sector. So this is people taking in each other's laundry by and large. So that's misleading as well. But the destruction of productivity is the point I wanted to make here. Go ahead. Now, here's a quote from, and I think you're familiar with this, many of you anyway, because we've referred to it several times and utilized it on our website as well. It's from Alexander Hamilton, and it's from the report on the National Bank. He says, this also is of great consequence in the general scale of national exertion than might perhaps on a superficial view be supposed, and has effects not altogether dissimilar from those of the circumstances last noticed. That is the last itemized factor that he's discussing here. To cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind by multiplying the objects of enterprise is not among the least considerable of the expedients by which the wealth of a nation might be promoted. Even things in themselves not positively advantageous sometimes become so by their tendency to provoke exertion, and so on. Every new scene which is opened to the busy nature of man to rouse and exert itself is the addition of a new energy to the general stock of effort. You can go on to the next. And this is why we're making the point. LaRouche is emphasizing this in his 4 laws, particularly in the point 4 in terms of a crash fusion energy development program, which takes in and encompasses the question of a massive new global space program for mankind. That this is why we have to go now. We have to go right now in terms of infrastructure. All right, we have Schumer, Senator Schumer, we have President-elect Trump talking about a major infrastructure program. All right, we have to go. We have no choice because of the flatline nature, the virtually dead nature of the U.S. economy and Europe. We have to go to the highest frontier areas of breakthroughs with crash programs, literal crash programs. And Paul made the point, Paul Gallagher made the point, economist with the Executive Intelligence Review the other night, made the point that in terms of a large-scale economic recovery program, infrastructure investment program in particular, that we can have no less, nothing less in terms on the federal level than high-speed rail. Any technology less than that, he said, let's not hear about sewers. It's not that we don't need sewer lines, but the point he's making is more fundamental. We have to go to technologies and set a standard no less than what's required in terms of high-speed rail. And he emphasized that we couldn't build high-speed rail right now in the United States. We don't have the capability. We're going to have to invite a collaboration with Japan, with China, both of those countries in particular. Perhaps the French can play a role as well, but particularly Japan and China, they have the most advanced wherewithal and knowledge to come in and help develop and build out a high-speed rail system in the United States. Either build it, we're talking about 20 to 40,000 miles of high-speed rail. We need ultimately 40,000 miles approximately of high-speed rail. First high-speed rail, 21,000, and then the second stage would be another 20,000 or so high-speed rails in terms of maglev to build that system. Either they're going to have to build that system for us or build it in collaboration, and there will be technology transfer from them into the United States, building up, either way, developing the American workforce in the process of building out this enormous program. And this is roughly equivalent to what China has today. They have they're in the range of getting up to 20,000 high-speed rail miles. They're not there yet, but they're going in that direction. And so we're talking about doing here in the United States what China is doing right now. So that also underscores the importance of the space program. This is a photograph. You might see the dress, but I can tell you the person on the left there, you can imagine this is not the normal NASA space workforce uniform. This is India. This is India's space program, and as you know, India's already gone to Mars, and landed an explorer on Mars, a probe on Mars. So these programs are absolutely essential because we don't have the workforce with the skills today that we've got to have it at to prosper. Now, I wanted to just briefly speak to some concepts. Concepts may be too strong a word, but words that get bandied around, like the issue of productivity. Productivity. Normally, most people, when they think about productivity, they, in some sense, are talking about how do you cut labor costs? How do we get more from the same amount of labor or from less labor? When, as the quote of Alexander Hamilton indicates, that's completely back-asswards. The question of productivity is, how do I develop the workforce? How do we develop the skills, the creativity, most fundamentally, of our population? How do we unleash that capacity to increase productivity through the application of breakthroughs in science? Breakthroughs coming out of a renewed U.S. space program and world effort towards the moon and beyond. That's how you increase productivity. That was understood, has been understood in the past. That has to become the sine qua non of an approach today. Parenthetically, what has been proposed by the Donald Trump campaign, I don't have a window into Donald Trump's mind, so I don't know what he's thinking at this moment himself, or what others around him are thinking at this point. But the Donald Trump campaign proposal that Wilbur Ross was instrumental in writing, a brief 10-page proposal, is for $1 trillion. That's $1 trillion spent over 10 years. $1 trillion. And this is supposedly a big deal. Over 10 years. So figure that out. That's 100, what is that? 100 billion a year. That, You know, and then think about what we're spending on wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. I mean, you know, China this last year spent 1.4 trillion on infrastructure in China itself.
Western China.
Yeah, just in China in 1 year. So if you're,
is that dollars or won?
that's dollars. That's dollars equivalent. I'm sure they're spending it in yuan. but that's so if we're actually serious, obviously we've got to go back to the drawing board. And just to be clear on this, Senator Schumer is proposing $1 trillion as well in federal funds, and he's talking about it, you know, over 10 years. I mean, at least that's the assumption of what he's talking about. You know, I don't think he has an actual concrete proposal on the table. Hillary Clinton's campaign was talking about $500 billion over 5 years. So that's exactly, you know, per annum or whatever. That's, you know, it's just, you're talking the same numbers. So, so rather than this, this takes an entirely different approach if we're actually thinking about productivity from the top down. Risk is a term that gets kicked around in terms of economics. I mentioned 401ks. Well, you know, we really don't need pensions. If people put their money into 401ks and they're advised by competent financial advisors, who of course take a percentage off the top and so forth of your 401k in the course of advising you, you'll make more money and with very little additional risk. Oh. Well, as we all found out, whether we were in 401ks or not, we know what happened with the last crash to those 401ks, and the risk was entirely different, right, than what it was presented, because they had disconnected the concept of risk from the physical economy. Right. Risk was a matter of financial activity and knowing how to play the market. When in fact, in that entire period, the US economy was being drawn down, wage levels were declining, unemployment was increasing, and the workforce was shifting from well-paid, high-skilled jobs into low-paid service jobs. And so obviously underlying it all, there was no there underneath the markets, ultimately, right? And so the risk was growing by leaps and bounds, as LaRouche, as an economist, warned, and that's what unfolded. So this concept of risk, I mean, today, Dallas policemen and firemen are learning that their pension fund is completely underfunded. You know, that it was put in the hands of certain financial advisors, consultants, and so forth, who monkeyed around, you know, and played games on paper and hid their losses and so forth. And so now the firemen and policemen of Dallas, Texas, one of the country's largest cities, are up the creek. And there's a scramble. And knowing now that the pension is underfunded, senior police officers and firemen are rushing to pull their money out of the pensions in lump sum amounts. So, you know, so they'll have something, which of course is fueling, you know, compounding the very crisis that exists there. Here in Houston, we've just gone through a negotiation with the firemen and others, right, as regarding the pension fund. And so suddenly firemen, particularly younger firemen and their families, are finding that they're not going to have the same kind of health care. They're not going to have the same kind of retirement pay and so forth down the road as they thought they were going to be when they were being trained at the community colleges and elsewhere to become firemen or go through the process of becoming police officers, law enforcement officers, and so on. So so this question of risks, and then there's this idea of public-private partnerships. Not to belabor this, but again, why are these corporations so eager to get into public-private partnerships? Except that because they're tied to the government will be there essentially to bail them out. In other words, they want to reduce their risk by what? Shifting the burden onto the taxpayer. You know, so that if they can't make enough in user fees on the toll roads, you know, that are public-private partnerships, they'll get it back by unloading it one way or another onto government agencies, and which is part of the Wilbur Ross Trump infrastructure program. Leaves that door open that, in fact, well, perhaps the government will want to buy these projects back from us after we build them.
That's called what, Wilbur Ross?
It's Wilbur Ross, along with a business a business professor out in California, authored the what's called the Trump plan. The Trump plan to build to create an infrastructure bank, which is what I was referring to earlier. So that's sometimes referred to as a public-private partnership proposal, because the U.S. government would offer something on the order of $160 billion in tax credits to get hedge funds and so forth to put their money into this bank. You know, kind of it would be a trade-off. Put your money in and you'll immediately get these tax breaks.
Right.
Tax breaks. And then having put approximately 200 billion total into this quote unquote infrastructure bank, then the quote unquote bank would then go out to the markets and say, okay, now the rest of you guys come in as well, because we can make money off of this. And part of the idea is we'll make money off this because ultimately we can count on the government to backstop what we're doing. I'm not trying to get into that. We discussed this 2 weeks ago, but just briefly, I mean, just be aware, if you have, again, this question of risk, a different aspect of risk in this silly world of speculation. If you're a hedge fund and you're putting money into something to build it, you're not going to want to wait 20 or 40 years for a payoff. A high-speed rail system is going to, just the first stage it's going to take about 20 years to build out. There's not going to be any user fees on that railroad. That, you know, you buy a ticket, you're not going anywhere for 20 years on that system, by and large, right? So there's no money that's going to be coming in to Wilbur Ross or anybody else if they're part of one of these infrastructure bank schemes, right? So the only thing they're going to be interested in investing in is short-term projects, which can give a quick turnaround and begin generating user fees almost immediately. So you're back to toll roads, you're back to low technology, right? As opposed to a crash program, you're back to low technology, low wage projects, which won't boost the country at all. It'll just add another layer of expenditures.
It also seems that what they call money, you know, putting their money in, of course, without Glass-Steagall, all sorts of crazy stuff is called money, right? Hedge funds and so forth, crazy stuff.
Oh yeah, sure.
They want to be converting that into something.
No, it's
tangible or something for it to vaporize.
Mm-hmm. So, and then I'd like to just briefly bring up the term leverage, because again, I mean, from a Hamiltonian standpoint, what's risk? Risk is saying we're going to make a commitment, you know, to the future of the nation, to the future productivity of the nation, and we're going to extend credit to the population through selected infrastructure programs, as was done under Franklin Roosevelt, for example, in Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Think of that as well in terms of leverage. What are you leveraging with high-speed rail? What are you leveraging with crash programs in terms of the project to colonize the moon? What you're doing is you're leveraging the fallow, underutilized or unutilized productive capacities, potentials of your population, as opposed to leveraging, well, I've got some money in my hedge fund. I've suckered in a bunch of people to invest in my hedge fund, and with Wilbur Ross or whoever, we're going to come up with a scheme in which we're going to double our money in 5 years. through some kind of set of projects. So the concept is entirely different. What we're now moving into is a revolution again in the U.S. economy, going back to a Hamiltonian system because it's the only system that'll work. I mean, Donald Trump doesn't have any choice. He's not a Hamiltonian. I mean, maybe he'll become one. We'll have to see. But, he doesn't think like a Hamiltonian. But it's the only system that will work unless we harness the productive capabilities, the inherent creative capacities of every man, woman, and child on this planet more productively than we've been doing by far. We won't make it. And we'll be back into an environment of wars and confrontation and, each against all, fighting over scraps. So we're at this breaking point. We now have a vote against globalization. We have now the issue of infrastructure on the table. We have China proposing. We have Russia proposing. We have all of these initiatives. And so let me just conclude just with a few short notes on there. I mean, just finally, I mean, the point could be, I guess, summarized that, the aim of the Hamiltonian system is I'm paraphrasing, to produce the emergence of genius among our population. That's the intent of a Hamiltonian policy. Here, just quickly, is the staggering dimensions of the New Silk Road. And as you may know, we published in 2015, the New Silk Road becomes the World Land Bridge Report. And this is now available, including in the Houston office, in Arabic and Chinese, as well as English. These reports are now circulating internationally and have been major Bibles for these projects going forward. But let me just review quickly some of what China has done in terms of the New Silk Road, their initiatives of China in terms of what's been called the One Belt, One Road, and otherwise the Eurasian Land Bridge. President Xi Jinping himself, he's visited 37 countries on state visits. He's made bilateral agreements with 56 states. He's signed memorandums of understanding for planning operations with regional organizations, the European Union, the Central and East European countries, the Mekong neighboring states, the African Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, ASEAN, and so on and so forth. 39 cargo routes have been developed and are now operating between China and Europe, bringing trains into Europe every week, 39 routes. These involve Chinese state corporations, the China Railroad Group, the China Communications Construction Company. 38 large infrastructure projects in 26 countries have been part of building out these 39 rail routes. On the Silk Road, on the China side of this, 98 new airports have been built. Shortly, on the entire One Belt, One Road across Central Asia, no city will be more than 100 miles from a major airport. China has 20,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, and they aim to have 50,000 kilometers of high-speed rail by the year 2020. That's 4 years away. That's how fast they're building it. They are the fastest builders of high-speed rail. It's highly automated, very sophisticated. This is not Chinese coolie labor, out there with sledgehammers or something. Yeah, pickaxes and so on. This is.
I don't know if you're familiar with this. I saw last week on the Chinese information about that, where they are building 40 18-wheeler a day for the service of that construction that will go to Serbia, I believe that, when they had the contract last week with Serbia.
Okay.
In
18-wheeler trucks.
18-wheeler, but there's a lot of other machines.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm just, again, yeah.
And practically a university to study that. Not the teacher, the student, hundreds of students, like the guy from Germany that worked on the training in China.
Yeah.
Why don't you do that in Germany? Because you don't have 1,000 good students that can start with 24 years energy and passion for this,
Mhm.
and you pay too much for someone that is cleaning floors, more than an engineer that's building rockets and things like this.
Well, let me just continue. Yes, I mean, there's all this interchange. German companies are relocating facilities to China, high-tech German companies and so forth, because that's where the markets are. And there's a tremendous interchange. You have the telecom companies, 4G mobile network. You have China Unicom, China Mobile, TD-LTE, Net Communications. These companies are now in 30 countries, including China, the United States, Japan, India, Saudi Arabia, Russia. There's been an explosion of trade between 2013 and 2016. On the New Silk Road, trade has jumped to $3.1 trillion, tripling essentially the trade volume.
A year?
Yeah,
A year.
yeah, per year. The 5 new economic zones have been built on China borders with, these are cross-border economic zones. They're part in one country, part in China. So they exist now in Vietnam, on the border with Vietnam, in Myanmar, Burma, in Mongolia, on the Russian border, and soon in Bangladesh. You have 15 economic cooperation zones that have been created, including with North Korea, with Russia, with Vietnam, with Kazakhstan, and so on and so forth. You have 52 economic special zones in 18 countries. This includes Ethiopia, Zambia, Egypt, Nigeria, Hungary, and 4 zones in Russia. These are largely manufacturing transfer zones where manufacturing capacity, which is now being idled in Russia, excess steel production capacity, this kind of thing, is being moved physically, setting up manufacturing capabilities in other countries for their own domestic need and partly for export back to China itself.
They're like Peru and Chile.
Yes, yes, like Peru and Chile. You have presently, you have 40 energy projects abroad being built by China. These are power plants, electricity grids, oil and gas pipelines in 19 countries. The Central Asia gas pipeline was started already in 2014. You have the huge Russia-China gas pipelines, which were started in 2014. You have nuclear projects with Romania, with Great Britain, with Pakistan, with Argentina. You have water projects in Angola, Brazil, Nepal, Pakistan, Argentina, and Ecuador, I know as well. And then you have the BRICS countries. It goes on and on and on. This is already, Helga Zepp-LaRouche has made the point that, and this is where I'm deriving this list, is from Helga's presentation to the Peruvian economists, is that this is already 12 times larger than the Marshall Plan after World War II. 12 times larger. 12 times larger. You know, enormous amounts of resources. The AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank of the BRICS countries, the Silk Road Fund, these are very important. But the banks, the China Export-Import Bank is involved in 1,000 projects, financing 1,000 projects itself. The China Development Bank is financing 900 projects in energy, raw materials, transport in 60 countries. So this is the dimensions of this. And this is what we can bring the United States into coherence with and take this both conceptually and bring it into the United States, but also bring it physically into the Americas from top to bottom across the Bering Straits, high-speed rail, Nawapa, and the rest. So that's what we're on the verge on. But we've got to redefine these terms in terms of real Hamiltonian LaRouche terms, in terms of economics, in terms of these concepts of productivity, risk, credit, and leverage and so forth from the standpoint of leveraging and developing our real capacities. Helga Zepp-LaRouche, in her speech in Peru, said that Americans must realize that what we're now dealing with is not an American crisis, nor is there merely an American solution. Economically, hundreds of millions around the world are facing poverty, hunger, lack of health care, unemployment, homelessness, lack of fresh water, and other extreme conditions. At the same time, the financial banking crisis is gripping the entire transatlantic world. So we've got our plate full. So with that, I'd like to just conclude by just quickly referencing a few quotes from LaRouche's 4 laws, which are available here on the table outside. They're available on our website. They're available and included in the Hamiltonian, the book, The Vision of Alexander Hamilton, with Hamilton's 4 major writings to Congress and the President George Washington. So the 4 laws, just the four brief quotes. The first, the immediate enactment of the Glass-Steagall Law instituted by U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt without modification as to principle of action. Secondly, a return to a system of top-down and thoroughly defined national banking. For the present circumstances, all other banking and currency policies are to be superseded or simply discontinued. Banks qualifying for operations under this provision shall be assessed for their proven competence to operate as under the national authority for creating and composing the elements of this essential practice, which has been assigned as by tradition to the original office of Secretary of the U.S. Treasury under Alexander Hamilton. Fourth, the purpose of the use of a federal credit system is to generate high productivity trends in improvements of employment with the accompanying intentions to increase the physical economic productivity and the standard of living of the persons and households of the United States, to create a general economic recovery of the nation per capita and for the rate of net effect in productivity, and by reliance on the essential human principle which distinguishes the human personality from the systemic characteristics of lower forms of life. And finally, the fifth, adopt a fusion driver crash program. So we can certainly open it up for discussion. Comment? Yes, Ted. Yep.
You know, it's like the general impression I have is that, like, since the end of World War II, we have used, not only us, but like Russia and other states as well, have used building for military purposes as a primary driving engine for their economies. But the problem with that is if you go on building for World War III and World War IV and World War VII, World War VIII long enough, sooner or later it's going to happen. Right? Now,
that's a downside. That's definitely a downside.
Right. And the other, there's other problems. It's not productive. It doesn't really produce anything. And there's one extreme case that I've been reading.
Mike, can you go down to the World War II towards the end of the pictures? We stopped with the graphs. I mean, that was fine.
There's an extreme case which I've been reading about recently, which is the F-35 fighter program, which is $1 trillion or more. Maybe it's starting to look like more like $1.5 trillion these days. I don't know.
Right.
And these aircraft are like $1 billion a piece. And the latest, these are supposed to be,
and they're not flying. They're just a mess.
The whole program is a mess, but the whole thinking behind the F-35 is that it's never going to engage in dogfights.
Well, let's go back to World War II because it's really
just up their radar game in such a way that the latest generation of Russian radar sees this thing as easily as it would see a P-51.
Sure, there's all that tip in it, but I'm saying let's concentrate on the principles involved, because there is an important principle, because it was the organized recovery of the U.S. economy under Roosevelt, the physical economy that began in 33, which actually allowed the U.S. to carry out the mobilization to defeat fascism. And here's just I think these are drive shafts being produced probably for tanks. I'm guessing. But this is a factory floor in the United States as part of the war mobilization. Go on to the next slide. And I think I've got, here's a picture. This is simply one facility.
You couldn't see
building bombers. right, for the U.S. Effort, World War II effort. Go on to the next.
And this was principally women working on it.
Well, to a large degree.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, and that I wanted to get to this just because this is, this is from 1940. If you see it at the bottom there, 40 to 45. The massive increase, and you see it divided there by categories from equipment and supplies, communications, combat and military vehicles, ammunition, guns and fire control, ships, aircraft. The enormous expansion that took off and was accomplished in 5 years, less than 5 years, right? This was an incredible. Mr. LaRouche has made the point many times that that we won the war not because the American soldier was so superior. In fact, he was not as competent as the German soldiers were. They had more experience and so forth, and they were just man by man better soldiers at that point. But we won because we had the in-depth
Superior logistics.
the superior logistics, exactly. Yeah. So,
But then you see it wound down, right? But then.
let me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's a good point, Joe. That's a good point. Because we have a screen here and they can't see where these other voices come from. No, that's all right. That's right. No, and that's and what was and as you know, Joe, I'm sure this was the point you were going to make. After World War II, well, in 1944, Roosevelt died. Roosevelt's intention, as he stated, as he made clear, was to convert this military capability, production capability, logistics capability, to not only just civilian use internally in the United States, but importantly, to use it as an export capacity to develop the formerly colonized world, the so-called third world, right? The developing countries, as they're called today, that are now being developed by China and the BRICS nations and so forth. So yeah, all of that capacity that had been built up, was basically thrown away. I mean, many of you probably lived in parts of the country. I know on the West Coast. I mean, in the Bay Area, you had these towns like Pittsburgh, California. You know what that was named after, right? And these were huge steel complexes and shipbuilding complexes, and they were all just gutted. They were just they don't exist anymore. They were just disappeared.
Steel furnaces were blown up.
Yeah. So we've done this before, and I think that's where I wanted to go with it, Ted, was just to say, this can be. There was never any need for a war to make this process possible, and in fact, it originally wasn't for a war. It was for an economic recovery, but then it was harnessed for the war effort against fascism.
Now, it has to be for something other than war, and it has to be understood that we're building for a future, not to destroy ourselves. I mean,
absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely.
But by the time that Eisenhower left, when you had the Korean War and all that, I mean, what he was warning about was that a culture of permanent war was being brought in. Wasn't that what he was talking about, with the military-industrial complex and all of that?
Well, and that's the potential of this incoming administration, particularly as we harness it with our delegations on Capitol Hill, with the work we're doing across the country. You have a deep state apparatus. You have what used to be called the white shoe boys. You have in the revolving door between Wall Street and the intelligence community and all of in the British intelligence capacities that we documented as playing the role that it played in the John F. Kennedy assassination, among other things. The potential now is that could be ripped out. Certainly, the Mad Dog Mattis, the incoming Secretary of Defense, the incoming National Security Advisor to Donald Trump, these are not insiders, and they're in a certain sense rogue people who. I'm sorry.
Rogue generals.
Rogue generals who know where the bodies are buried, and so you could this is the opportunity, and it's critical that we get a handle on, and we strip out this unseemly, undemocratic, unrepublican apparatus that's grown up as the so-called military-industrial corporate complex, as Eisenhower actually originally called it.
So all the companies that benefited from the last 20 years of wars are pretty much like Lockheed, Halliburton, General Dynamics, or one small core group of companies, and also financial institutions.
Well, I think this is where the Alexander the Great principle comes in, as Lynn's called it for years. Alexander the Great had to deal with a whole bunch of generals, after he couped his father, and marched the army, as opposed to marching it into Greece to conquer Athens and so forth, marched it east to crush the Persians.
Right.
And as you know, you probably know the story. I mean, and so he had to take these generals and turn them around and march them in the other direction and get them, rolling with himself.
And defeat Emperor Darius.
Right. So, these corporations, sure, this is part of this transfer. Part of the transfer of wealth from wages and the workforce was also a transfer from small and medium-sized companies, and was a transfer from small towns and cities and into large corporations and whatnot, right? Multinational corporations. And so you have this concentration of wealth in increasingly concentrated. Okay, so now you've got to convert it. You've got to divest it to some degree, probably. But the main thing is you shift the investments. You shift where is the credit being extended? What are we leveraging? Are we leveraging wars? Or are we leveraging the creative capacities, the future of our people? And if we make that shift, then these companies are going to have to roll, with the program. And you can imagine, that's where the credit's going to be extended. Okay, well, it's not going to be extended for useless, endless wars, right? Trotskyist endless wars, right? The neocon wars. Instead, it's going to be we're going to have to produce steel. But the figure that we came up with, 42,000 miles of electrified rail in the United States, high speed and maglev. Well, we need 1,000 power substations. We need 10,000 locomotives. We need 15.5 million tons of high tensile steel. We need 22 million tons of cement. We need 50 gigawatts of power production, largely nuclear power. That's where the action's going to be. So can you help? Can you function? Well, then maybe we've got work for you. If not, we're gonna go to other companies, right? And you'll be left on the. So you can see how this, and then other factors can come into play: investment, tax credits, other things, to say, okay, this is the new world. These are the rules.
And so the education policy has to be directed towards getting nuclear engineers, getting people who know how to build steel.
Well, and that's the point of a high-speed rail system. This is exactly what China did. They needed a national high-speed rail system, but they also had to have a vehicle in another sense, by which they could upgrade the skill and educational levels of their population. Right? You just can't offer everybody to have a nice schooling if there aren't any jobs.
Right.
So the construction of the high-speed rail system, which are very, these are very advanced. I mean, they've got to be designed with wind tunnels, the question of ballast, the question of,
Well, the bill of materials must have been a huge thing to try to figure out.
But I'm just making the point, it's also sophisticated. It's more sophisticated than one might think at first sight, in terms, Paul had pointed out a week ago or so that, in Japan, just as for instance, every week in Japan on the high-speed rails, you got people out there walking up down the high-speed, the tracks, taking very careful measurements to make sure those tracks have not shifted, you know, are absolutely precise, because when you've got trains rolling at those kinds of speeds, you know, the tolerances are fine, and you can't mess around. So the whole question of,
Are they all maglev? Do those trains roll, or are they all
they
maglev?
roll. No, they're almost entirely high speed.
But that's not operational yet.
That's where we're going.
10 years.
Maglev, and China's announced that they're going to have their own domestically produced maglev by 2020, which will operate at somewhere in the range of 450 to 500 kilometers an hour. So, you know.
So the purpose of the high-speed trains is to transport goods as well as.
My point is that it's to train the workforce. In building the high-speed rail system, then you're developing the capacities of your population at the same time. You're maturing your population at the same time. Right. And the rail is for both passenger and for freight. I mean, it's both.
Yeah.
Often double tracked and so forth, and all the rest. Right.
Oh, speaking of Lockheed, the same company that makes the F-35 also made the Juno spacecraft, so they could
Do something better. Yeah.
they'd be much happier working on space systems than private.
Right. Just like a lot of these oil and gas guys would like to go back to work for NASA where they were before they lost their jobs. No, good point. No.
Well, as far as the fourth of the four laws where Lynn says we got to have a driver with fusion and space, this is the horizon that we're moving toward, right? I mean, it seems to me, because when this question of privatization comes up in the field, I mean, some people are really fanatical about it. You know, well, we've got to let the free market do it. The market can do it better than the government can do it, and blah, blah, blah. I mean, it seems it's time for us to really just blow that whole concept out of the water. I mean, I don't know what you think. I mean, obviously there's a place for private contractors, you know, everywhere, as it has always been the case with NASA, right? But the whole idea that the markets are going to get their paws on the space program and determine
again, think of it. I mean, Keisha was just saying from the back, Alexander Hamilton principle. That's how you do it. And I just fold into that the Alexander the Great principle. I mean, it's the same principle. If there's leadership from the top, you know, then the companies will fall into line.
But it seems the whole idea of privatization is very insidious.
The main thing that you didn't get was the thing that he mentioned before, which is that if you're going to do it right, you have to have a long-term perspective. Okay, for example, if you decide you're going to build something on Mars with people involved, you cannot do it with chemical rockets. So you have to develop fusion power, and there's no company that's.
Let me just repeat this for the.
Right.
I don't know if it's being caught. Can they hear it? Okay, all right, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Anyway, yeah. So the point being that if you are actually taking the revolutionary thing that will increase the productivity, and not just taking something you already have the capability of doing, and figuring out how to get people to put it together more cheaply, because you're paying them less. You don't have to do any research. It's all been figured out. You're just mass producing something that's already a known quantity.
Teach the Hamilton principle.
Right.
You know, if Americans are stupid enough to think that it's cool that we're going to put people in a tin can and shoot them to Mars and give them a 50-50 chance of even getting there, you know, that's a space program, well, we're lost. Right. You know, anybody with any brain has got to recognize that, as Mike was just outlining, a crash program over decades is not something that SpaceX or any of these guys can manage. You know, they're not in it for that. I mean, SpaceX is in it for the their stock is going through the ceiling until one of their planes blows up, and then it drops towards the floor again. You know, but it's just short-term speculation. I mean,
It's a different version of a crash.
Crash program. Yeah. The SpaceX crash program. Yes. Yes.
A couple of things. It's like, you know,
can I finish what I was saying here? Because I remember when we were trying to get the SDI, right? And right, for Reagan, and it had to happen real quick, and it didn't happen. And it didn't happen partially because Heritage Foundation and these bums came in there with their free market, nostrums, of which there was a weakness in the Reagan administration to this stuff. Plus the fact that the shuttle blew up, because of what the FBI was doing there and put everything on hold for 3 years. And so we got to get the ball rolling on this. And I think it would be, because it's this prejudice, particularly among Republicans, the markets, right?
Well,
We got to take head on.
Again, look, you got to have a sense of flanking some of this stuff. I wrote up a paper, a research paper, just in part because I wanted to do it for myself, to just go through and kind of take apart what all of these private space projects were and how they all kind of fit or didn't fit together and so forth, how it all stacked up, and it doesn't stack up. I know what you're talking about in that regard, but again, it's so educate the people, spread the Hamilton's principles, get people reading, give these as Christmas gifts, get people reading the 4 papers of Hamilton and LaRouche's 4 laws. If the American people aren't educated and up to speed, then it won't happen. And this opportunity will again, as found a little people, to paraphrase Shelley.
And also the Putin.
But I'd also add the Strategic Defense Initiative. This is something we want to begin talking with people a lot about, to bring forward in discussions to kind of open up again for them this period of history. The March 23rd, 1983 speech where Reagan announced LaRouche's beam weapons defense policy. There was the opportunity. It was right there within reach. Now we have Russia reaching out to us, along with China, in a similar vein. LaRouche's methodology, LaRouche's thinking. This is Hamilton today. So I think it's very important pedagogically to bring forth, but not just negatively, bring forth what, we almost pulled it off. Between here and Europe, what Lynn pulled together around the SDI, and with people like Tiller and the military people on both sides of the Atlantic and so on. At that time it was the rejection by the Russians that really, the Russians influenced by the British in particular that cooed that effort. But it was almost achieved, and that had long-term, profound positive effects inside Russia that's still playing out today, with these circles around Glass-Steagall, the inheritors of the tradition of Primakov and so forth, who recognize, LaRouche's thinking, not only that it was right then, but his methodology is the fresh methodology which is required today. And so I think it's really something, that would be maybe Joel wants to make a presentation on that at some point, or someone else, but a presentation on the Strategic Defense Initiative and what was actually involved in that effort, and how we're profiting from it today. Even lasers. We wouldn't have the kind of laser capabilities in industry and so forth that we have today if it hadn't been for the SDI program.
And that leads right into LaRouche's space program, the Woman on Mars program.
Yes.
Technologies, spin-offs, and how that was going to advance into the future. So, which LaRouche is very much emphasizing right now. His vision, along with the German-American space pioneer, Anericans' vision for a long-term, productive crash program in science, technology, space development, where we would have been today if those programs had not been halted.
Yep. I think what I'd like to do is, I think this has been a really good discussion. What I'd like to just do is end the presentation for now, or discussion officially for now, and we can continue to talking.